grateful to be with you all today to discuss the powerful and essential role that investors have to play in advancing racial and economic equity. As you heard from Lori, and we say in that Impact Entrepreneur article, achieving racial and economic equity, it's a defining opportunity of our time. Our governments and civil society can't do it alone. The private sector, especially investors, have both a unique opportunity and also a fundamental responsibility to champion racial and economic equity within their organizations and portfolios. We believe the future of our economy and society depends on it. And last year, PolicyLink, CapEQ, and the Global Impact Investing Network, we came together to develop new racial equity metrics for the GINS IRIS Plus platform, the generally accepted system for measuring and managing impact among investors. Now, our partnership is under the Corporate Racial Equity Alliance, a group founded by PolicyLink, FSG, and Just Capital, and including a broad ecosystem of partners today. Our guiding ethos in our partnership and our work is equity. That means the just and fair inclusion into a society in which all of us, not just some of us, can participate, prosper, and reach our full potential. And our mission is to support the evolution of anti-racist, equitable companies and investors that can effectively contribute to building a just, equitable, and healthy society for all of us. In the same way that we know we cannot achieve racial and economic equity without business leaders being in lockstep with us in civil society, we need investors to unabashedly champion equity too. People of color are dramatically underrepresented as decision makers in the financial industry, as well as dramatically underrepresented as beneficiaries of capital investments. This continues to fuel unequal and unjust allocation and distribution of capital, allowing dominant groups to benefit more from the tools of capitalism as compared to people of color. Now, as more investors begin to recognize the powerful and essential role they have to play in advancing racial and economic equity, it's more important than ever that we have a united approach to integrating equity into our everyday practices, our policies, and investing strategies to close racial gaps within their four walls and within the businesses and communities that investors invest in. Now, the time for investors to center equity and justice has never been more urgent. You heard Lori say that globally widening inequality and racial and ethnic discrimination, it's threatening peace, it's threatening social cohesion and economic stability. And in America alone, nearly 100 million people, that's 1 in 3 of us, live in economic insecurity and are locked out of fair opportunities to thrive. Now, we know what got us here is not going to be what will carry us forward toward an equitable and sustainable future for all of us. We need to do more. We need to be more. And we also know that we're in the midst of incredible headwinds against equity today. It's real, with zero-sum narratives about racial equity proliferating. This is going to continue. So how can we strengthen ourselves to persevere through the headwinds? Well, today, as you heard from Melanie, we're going to dive into 6 common pitfalls and how to work through them, not only for those investors starting out, but also for those who are more advanced in their racial equity journeys. So now we're ready to bring up the slides. And Ty, I'm going to pass it over to you so we can dive right into the key pitfalls.
Sounds great. Thank you, Mahalet. If you go to the next slide, I'll start with our first pitfall that we mentioned in our piece. And so the first pitfall is really about thinking that this work and racial equity is just about diverse representation. But you've already heard from Mahalet that people of color are dramatically underrepresented as decision makers in the financial industry. In fact, of the $1 trillion of assets over trillions of dollars of assets under management, less than 1% are managed by women and people of color. That's a both and. And so that means that we don't have access to the capital. We're not able to distribute the capital. And so what needs to change is not just who is in the seat, but we also have to approach the areas of power, risk, and justice. So when we think about power, we need to shift power through investing in order to address the racial biases to ensure that equitable representation and decision-making within investment firms and investee companies. It's not just about, are you having people of color in these seats, but are they in seats of power and decision making? And that will help make sure that there's an increased deployment of capital to people of color and people historically marginalized due to race and or ethnicity. When you think about risk, you have to redefine risk in a way that changes what the concept of what riskiness looks like and what is a risky investment. In fact, risk is probably the most challenging one because people feel like risk profiles are an objective measure. You've put something in a set of criteria and something comes out as either risky or not. But those criteria and those processes themselves can be biased. And so it's really about changing that perception of risk in order to make sure that people who are historically marginalized by race and or ethnicity are having equal access. And the last piece is really about making sure that those two process points yield in advancing racial justice. It's really about promoting racial justice. And so you want to make sure that the capital is actually landing. It's not enough to just change the processes, but are we investing in things that are actually providing capital to people of color? And are the types of things that we're investing in equitable? And there's a list of types of industries that we know are not equitable. Things like the prison industry, things like issues that are environmental and affect communities of colors more. So it's not just about, is the capital landing, but it's capital fueling things that get us closer to equity. So that's the first pitfall. If we go to the next slide, I'll give a little bit more background on the second pitfall, which is, so if we move to the next slide, slide 2, thank you, is that we're not just using the impact management, the measuring of racial equity in order to claim victories. This is not about using it to say, I'm great, you're not. This really is about us stepping back and making sure that we're on the way and building racial equity. We're guiding growth. So we want to acknowledge that racial equity in investment strategies requires persistence and deep commitment. It's not a box checking exercise. It requires commitment, not just personally and individually, but at the organizational level. And the reason why is that these existing racial inequities are a result of long-standing systemic decisions with consequences that were born over centuries. Within the context of capital markets, people of color, as we've mentioned and we'll mention multiple times, are dramatically underrepresented both as decision makers and as beneficiaries of capital. And so this unequal and unjust allocation of capital has made sure that people, the way that the system is built right now, means that if you leave it alone, or even if you have a few boxes that you check on this path to racial equity, inevitably it will continue to drive inequity. So you want to make sure that you have diligent, intentional processes, consistent and rigorous evaluation of outcomes, and making sure that we recognize it's both, this journey of racial equity is both a process itself and an outcome, and you can't have one without the other. So when you apply these process-oriented changes, you're more likely to promote greater racial equity in the investor's organizational operations, and then those processes themselves will then contribute to developing more equitable outcomes. So that's why it's also a both and. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Lissa for the next 2 slides.
Thanks, Ty. Mine naturally build on yours, so that's great. The third pitfall for investors, particularly those who are just starting out on their racial equity journey, is a really common one. We see it a lot, and it's that investors are feeling a growing demand for shifts towards racial equity. They feel that internally, they feel it externally, they feel it personally. And what that often leads to is a sense of urgency to act quickly and immediately and get moving. Here's the thing with that. It can be incredibly valuable to get going fast and to create an immediate internal effort towards integrating racial equity. To echo Ty's points, thinking about decision-making power, who has it, who doesn't, biased perceptions of risk, and what the actual outcomes of capital are. But what we often see also are that investors who do that first push and then kind of burn out, and then they don't keep pressing. And that's not going to change systems. That's a huge problem that we're seeing right now. To Ty's point also, these are systems that were built over centuries and centuries of intentional decision-making, and we are not going to fix them in a 6-month or 1-year effort. So what do investors need to do? They need to think about racial equity as a long-term strategy. And from the start, plan for that long-term investment. It requires really deep commitment. It requires persistence, both at the organizational level and at the individual personal level. So what organizations can do is focus first on gaining internal alignment and setting forth that long-term strategy, and then setting into place a couple of pieces that will help them continue to do those checks necessary to keep moving and understanding how to learn and grow. That then goes into the next one, number 4. And this is, we're shifting here a little bit more towards investors who have already started on their journey and are looking to deepen it. This is, of course, a spectrum. This one is big. There is a really big fear of making mistakes. I think, everyone makes mistakes. Investors and business leaders make mistakes, and it's part of investing. It's part of racial equity journeys, especially. We're seeing a lot of investors and business leaders having a growing understanding of racial inequities, what they're doing to contribute, what they're doing to adjust against, how systems work and how they perpetuate these inequalities. So we're seeing that deepening understanding, but we're also seeing folks hold back from bolder options and bolder actions because of that fear, because of the risk of what people might say, what internal stakeholders might think, all of those sorts of things. So the key here is to prepare for what those mistakes might be. Assume that folks are going to make mistakes along the way, and ensure that the organization has the leadership and the leadership training in place to be able to adjust in those moments of learning. Things like racial equity audits and regular internal conversations can help with some of those learning and adjustment to help you catch things quickly, minimize negative outcomes, and move forward with stronger and better planning. The transformation we need is not going to happen overnight, and it's certainly not going to happen if we set up one kind of push and just assume that it's going to work moving forward. And we don't see that with folks that are being really thoughtful. We see them planning for the long term, planning checks along the way, using impact measurement and management as a way to build those checks in, and then moving forward and adjusting as they go. From here, I'll pass it over to Mahalet.
Thank you, Lissa. We can go to the next slide. Now, the 5th pitfall is resistance to shifting power. No matter where you are on your journey, you should be aware of this pitfall and ready to work through it. So what do we mean here? A fundamental component of achieving racial equity, as you heard from Ty, is ensuring that historically excluded groups are proportionately represented in positions of power and leadership, and that the most impacted by injustice are actually decision makers in the design and implementation of equitable solutions. So it's time to rethink and expand who's making decisions about where and how capital is invested. It's time to rethink and expand who owns and benefits from capital. And it's time to expand who governs when the most important decisions are made. Within the firm, this means doing the work to ensure historically excluded groups, especially people of color, are represented fairly and meaningfully throughout the organization. This includes, and most importantly, it is the uppermost leadership levels. This is not a goal that we can afford to fail at, and yet we see lackluster commitment and investment in achieving this from many firms. People of color remain dramatically underrepresented, as we've said several times here. And we also hear about the importance of making a business case for diversity. So what's the business case? Or the business case for racial equity strategies? Well, consider this. What is the business case for the vast majority of capital in our economy to be controlled and held by a small group of wealthy white men? Is there a business case for that, for the status quo? There isn't. And in fact, things are not going so well right now for most people in our society. So shifting power supports resolving barriers that are holding all of us back. And when we look at the last 2 years, no doubt this is so much of what the so-called Great Resignation is all about. In addition to better pay, we see workers throughout our economy needing and demanding more opportunity, greater autonomy, and power over decisions that deeply affect their day-to-day lives. And the fact is that many of those in power right now, including in the investing field, have very little proximity to our society's greatest challenges, very little proximity to the real barriers experienced by people and communities that have been left behind. So it makes sense to ensure that those with proximity to the issues we're trying to solve actually are playing a role in decision-making around solutions. We all know that monetary capital broadly is one solution to so many of the problems we face. And that's why this applies broadly to all investing. As it relates to a firm's influence externally, shifting power means not only building and strengthening authentic community relationships, but also directly engaging and prioritizing communities in decisions on your investments. Investors also have a critical role to play here in ensuring power is balanced within the businesses they're investing in. So don't stop just within your organization. Also think about your investment portfolios and think about balanced power as an investment stream. In closing on this one, I see shifting power as part of the necessary evolution of corporate governance to become more equitable. Yet we still see a great deal of discomfort over this very idea and even this phrase, shifting power. Leaders that get this, however, they understand what it really means is ensuring that power is balanced. It means operationalizing the alignment of the firm's long-term interests with the interests of all stakeholders. So now we can go on to our last pitfall, which is the failure to build trust through transparency. It's important for investors to make the connection between the importance of rebuilding trust with workers and communities of color and being more transparent in organizational practices and where you are on the journey. After decades of lackluster results on DEI and decades, actually centuries of monetary capital concentrated in the hands of the few, trust is understandably broken among workers and communities of color. Rebuilding trust, it's going to require multiple interventions, one of which is much greater transparency in organizational practices, transparency of your long-term goals and targets, and where your organizations are on the journey. Transparency doesn't require perfection, as we say in the article. It doesn't require change overnight. As you heard from Lissa, that's not even how it's going to work. Instead, it requires a willingness to hold yourself accountable to continuous improvement and ultimately achieving equitable outcomes. Now, there's a widespread discomfort here too amongst investors and business leaders with disclosure on where organizations are on their racial equity journeys, from sharing disaggregated demographic data relating to the workforce to more robust disclosures around political activity. As a former corporate lawyer and general counsel, I get it, but this is one of the keys to rebuilding trust. Tell the real story. Flashy marketing campaigns are no longer going to cut it. This is also about the need for greater data and accountability for all stakeholders. There's a painful lack of rigor around data, and that means that there's an accountability gap. One way that organizations can move towards greater transparency is to set goals. Commit long-term resources, not one-time investments, to those goals. Hold leadership accountable to achieving those goals and act in coalition. And not be satisfied, finally, with repeated failure. Acceptance of repeated failure without learning from our mistakes is part of why we're here, part of why we are where we are today. And so I know that's a lot in all of these pitfalls. We hope, though, that sharing these pitfalls and the antidotes we discussed can support the growth of really a new normal, where all investors are intentionally integrating racial equity awareness and action in their investment strategies, portfolio decisions, and evaluation of return on investment. This is because equity, it's everybody's job, and there's no sector that can sit on the sidelines.